Last show of the season at entity value equals Saturday Night Live, category equals TV show, disambig equals NBC sketch comedy series. Always feels a little like the last day of school. Everyone is exhausted, slightly emotional, pretending they're not already thinking about sleeping for 3 straight weeks. The writers are wandering around Studio 8H clutching coffee cups like life preservers. The crew is smiling with that 1,000-yard stare that says, "We made it, but at what cost?" And somewhere in the building, someone is definitely eating a sandwich they stole from craft services. For me, the season finale has always carried an extra layer of pressure because of Weekend Update. It's the one part of the show where I can't hide behind a character, a wig, or the comforting knowledge that if a sketch bombs, at least there are 8 other people on stage bombing with me. On Weekend Update, it's just me, Michael Che, desk, and a live audience waiting to decide whether we're funny or should be replaced by a weather app. Che and I have been doing Weekend Update together long enough that we've developed the kind of friendship that can only be forged through shared trauma. We've sat next to each other through political scandals, celebrity meltdowns, awkward monologues, and more jokes about Congress than any 2 human beings should be legally allowed to hear. We know each other's rhythms, each other's tells, and each other's weaknesses, which is exactly why one year we decided that our end-of-season gifts to each other would be jokes, not normal jokes, not jokes we'd written together and carefully approved through the usual SNL process. No, we decided to make each other read jokes live on air that the other person had never seen before. If that sounds like a terrible idea, congratulations. You have the same survival instincts I lacked. The idea started innocently enough. We were backstage one night, both too tired to make good decisions, when Che said something like, "You know what would be funny? If we wrote jokes for each other to read cold on air." I laughed, because at first I thought he was kidding. And then I saw the look on his face. It was the look of a man who had just discovered a loophole in the Geneva Conventions. "We just give each other fun jokes," he said, smiling. "Fun?" I repeated, already suspicious. "Yeah, fun. Sabotage. Just jokes." Now, in my defense, I had known Michael Che for years. I had worked beside him through countless broadcasts. I had seen him eat gas station sushi without fear. I had seen him laugh at things that would make a normal person call a therapist. And yet, somehow, I still chose to trust him. That was my first mistake. The night of the first joke swap, Studio 8H was buzzing with the strange electricity that only exists during a live broadcast. The audience had settled into their seats. The cameras were gliding into position. I was sitting behind the update desk, trying to look calm while my stomach performed a drum solo. She leaned over and whispered, "You nervous?" "Not at all," I lied. He grinned. "Good, because I'm not trying to sabotage you." It was the second time he said it, which was exactly one more time than a trustworthy person would need to say it. When the cue came, we launched into Weekend Update like any other show. We delivered the usual headlines, traded the usual jokes, and everything felt normal. Then I turned to the camera and said, "Well, tonight is the last show of the season, and Che and I have decided that our end-of-the-year gifts to each other would be jokes." The audience cheered. "Yeah," Che added. "So we're making each other read jokes live on air that the other person has never seen before." I nodded, trying to sound confident. "And the idea, Michael, isn't to try to sabotage each other. It's just to give each other fun jokes." She looked at me with the expression of a cat watching a bird walk into a room full of windows. "Why don't you go first?" I said. "Okay," he replied, far too eagerly. First joke was harmless enough. A student in Texas nicknamed White Lightning had set a high school record by running the 100-meter dash in 9.98 seconds. Che handed me the punchline. Coincidentally, I read, "People call me White Lightning because I also finish in under 10 seconds." The audience erupted in laughter. I laughed too, partly because it was funny and partly because I was relieved. Maybe this really would be harmless. Maybe we'd just embarrass each other with a few mildly inappropriate jokes, hug it out and go home. Then came the next card. "Doctors in Iowa have confirmed a dog disease that can be passed on to humans." I read. Flip to the punchline. "Fine, I'll wear a condom." The audience laughed even harder. She leaned back in his chair, looking pleased with himself. I shot him a look that said, okay, I see what we're doing here. He smiled back as if to say, no, you do not. The jokes escalated quickly. A report about human activity disrupting chimpanzee culture in Africa led to a punchline about my grandpa calling hip-hop chimpanzee culture. A story about Pope Francis promising to confront clergy sex abuse head-on led to a punchline so outrageous that I genuinely stopped reading halfway through and stared at Shay like he had personally declared war on my career. It's not, come on, I protested, laughing in disbelief. Shay shrugged. I know, I think just the crap. The audience was howling, and that was the moment I realized the true genius of the joke swap. Humor wasn't just in the jokes themselves. It was in watching two people publicly discover in real time that their friend had no interest in protecting them. I handed Shay one of my cards, determined to retaliate. A substitute teacher in North Carolina has resigned after she reportedly told a class of elementary students that Martin Luther King Jr. killed himself. He read, he paused. In her defense, he continued, he is the one who decided to keep running his mouth. She looked up at me, horrified. You're going to get me murdered, he said. The audience laughed so hard I thought the desk might shake apart. We kept going. Study about Americans touching their mobile devices more than 2,000 times a day turned into a joke about my anatomy. Church in Massachusetts creating a nativity scene that commented on immigration by placing baby Jesus in a cage turned into a punchline so shocking that even I hesitated before reading it. Where he belongs, I said. Immediately covered my face with my hands as the audience exploded. At one point, I decided to switch things up. She didn't write this one, I announced. This is all me. She raised an eyebrow. Last week was National Rosa Parks Day, I read, or as we call it in my house, Uppity Bus Passenger Day. She stared at me. Oh, you're going to get letters about that, he said. Oh, God, I replied. The beauty of the joke swap was that neither of us could back out. Once the joke was on the card, the only options were to read it or admit defeat in front of millions of viewers. And in comedy, admitting defeat is somehow more embarrassing than saying something you'll regret forever. A story about Nigeria's president denying rumors that he had died and been replaced by a look-alike from Sudan led to a punchline that made me question every life choice that had brought me to that desk. A report about Hurricane Florence being the wettest in history somehow became a joke about the opening night of Magic Mike. By the time we reached the end of the segment, I was exhausted from laughing, cringing, and silently preparing my apology tour. Then I picked up the final card. Okay, time out, I read. I refuse to read this last joke, not because it's racist, but because there's a black man holding my cue card. The audience laughed nervously. I can't work like this, I continued. So Merry Christmas, homeboy. You're fired. I looked up at the cue card holder who was laughing harder than anyone in the room. Shay was doubled over in his chair. Somehow, against all logic, the segment was a massive success. People loved it. They loved the chaos, the unpredictability, the way Shay and I seemed genuinely terrified of what the other person had written. Joke swap became a tradition, and every year we returned to it with the enthusiasm of two people volunteering for a psychological experiment. The second year, I told myself I would be smarter. I would anticipate cheese traps, would maintain control. I was wrong. That year, one of the first jokes I had to read was about doctors struggling to convince black patients to take the COVID vaccine. Well, I read, maybe they should try telling them it makes you immune from paying child support. Shay immediately leaned back and said, whoa, that's pretty racist. Colin, the audience roared. I pointed at him. You wrote it! He shrugged innocently. The next card was about the sequel to Hocus Pocus being in development for Disney+. Judging by this picture, I read it's a movie about every white woman I've ever slept with. She nodded approvingly. Cool, he said. Well, yeah, it's fine. Then came another Rosa Parks joke. Then a joke about Jeffrey Epstein's Palm Beach mansion being demolished, which somehow ended with me saying I had so many fond memories there and calling Epstein king. Looked at Shay in disbelief. Rest in power, King, I repeated. Shay was laughing too hard to answer. The audience, meanwhile, was losing its collective mind. That's the thing about live television. Once the laughter starts, it becomes its own unstoppable force. The audience feeds off the performers feed off the audience, and suddenly everyone is participating in a moment that feels both wildly inappropriate and strangely communal. Shay took his turn reading my jokes, and I made sure he suffered just as much as I had. A story about Creed singer Scott Stapp playing Frank Sinatra in an upcoming movie led to a punchline about Scarlett Johansson playing Sammy Davis Jr. An obese monkey in Thailand named Godzilla being sent to a weight loss facility led to a joke that made stop mid-sentence and accuse me of racism. It's pretty racist, he said. Thank you, I replied. We went back and forth like that for what felt like hours, each joke pushing the boundary a little further, each reaction becoming funnier than the punchline itself. At the end of the night, I realized something important. Michael Che was not just my co-anchor. He was my comedy soulmate in the worst possible sense of the phrase. We had built a friendship on mutual respect, shared experience, and spoken agreement that if one of us was going down, the other would make sure it happened on live television. And honestly, I couldn't have asked for a better end-of-season gift. By the time the joke swap became an annual tradition, I should have known better. A rational person would have looked at the previous years, reviewed the evidence, and concluded that handing Michael Che unchecked power over my public reputation was a terrible idea. A rational person would have demanded legal representation. A rational person would have insisted on seeing the jokes beforehand. Unfortunately, I work in comedy. And in comedy, if something is dangerous and funny, people tend to focus on the second part. Every year, the ritual was basically the same. The audience knew what was coming. The writers knew what was coming. The crew knew what was coming. The only people who didn't know what was coming were the two idiots sitting behind the Weekend Update desk, which somehow made it even better. The anticipation started long before airtime. Backstage, people would walk by me and offer condolences the way they might speak to someone about to undergo surgery. Good luck tonight. Hope it's not too bad. Maybe he went easy on you this year. Nobody ever actually believed that last one. Least of all me. The worst part wasn't the jokes, it was the waiting. You sit there under the bright lights, smiling at the audience, pretending you're completely relaxed, while a stack of cue cards sits a few feet away containing information that could dramatically alter your future Thanksgiving dinners. And then the segment begins. One year, before we even start, there's a special guest sitting nearby, Dr. Hattie Davis, poet, author, activist, a genuinely respected figure, the kind of person who makes you instinctively sit up straighter and speak more carefully, which naturally meant Michael decided it was the perfect time to make me read the most horrifying jokes he'd ever written. The audience applauded as she was introduced. I remember thinking, this is wonderful. What an honor. Remembered what segment we were doing. Oh no, the audience settled. Shay smiled, the smile of a man who had already escaped the crime scene. Go ahead, Colin, he said. I picked up the first card. A group of geneticists had announced plans to bring back the dodo and reintroduce it to Africa. Simple enough, then I read the punchline. If you ask me, I can think of at least one dodo I'd like to reintroduce to Africa. The audience gasped and laughed at the same time. I looked immediately toward Dr. Davis. She stared back with the expression of someone questioning every decision that had brought her to this building. And we were only getting started. Next joke involved Beyonce. Now, let me be clear, there are certain people in America you should never casually joke about. The list includes national heroes, beloved grandparents, and Beyonce. She knew this, which is exactly why he targeted her. I read the setup about a photo she posted online. Then I reached the punchline. Beyonce looked so white that I was finally attracted to her. The audience exploded. I felt my soul leave my body. Somewhere, I imagined the Beyhive activating like a military defense system. There are probably emergency alarms specifically for that kind of statement. I could almost hear them whatting. Colin Jost has said something stupid again. Deploy immediately. The audience was howling. Jay was laughing so hard he could barely stay upright. And we still had an entire stack of cards left. That was the beauty of the joke. The joke itself wasn't always the funniest part. The funniest part was watching someone realize halfway through a sentence that they absolutely should not be saying it. The audience could see it happen in real time. You'd start confidently, then you'd hit the punchline, then your face would slowly transform into the expression of a man realizing he had accidentally walked into the wrong courtroom. That expression became the entire segment. It involved the Adult Survivors Act and lawsuits being filed years after alleged abuse had occurred. I started reading. The setup sounded normal. Then came the punchline. Figures. Because women love bringing up old stuff. The audience groaned, then laughed, then groaned again. It was the exact reaction Che wanted. He loved that uncomfortable space, that place where people didn't know whether to laugh or call a lawyer. And somehow, he always managed to find it. The segment continued. A joke about the Broadway musical MJ, a joke involving Michael Jackson, a punchline that made me pause, then another pause, then a longer pause. The audience was already laughing because they knew something terrible was coming. I finally delivered the line and the room erupted. At that point, I realized something. The audience wasn't laughing because they agreed with anything. They were laughing because everyone could see the trap. Everyone in the room understood that I had become a hostage reading a ransom note. That shared understanding made every punchline hit harder. By the end of the segment, I wanted to end on something positive, something uplifting, something that might partially repair the damage. The card in front of me appeared promising. It referenced tensions in the Middle East. I thought maybe this was a sincere message. Maybe Che had finally decided to show mercy. That hope lasted approximately 3 seconds. I read, "Whether you're Jewish or Muslim, y'all need Jesus." The audience burst into applause. Came back, the segment ended, and somehow that was one of the less stressful joke swaps because things escalated. They always escalated. The following year, I arrived with what I thought was a brilliant strategy. I would stay emotionally detached. No matter what was on the card, no matter how shocking, no matter how absurd, I would simply read the joke. No reaction, no panic, no visible distress. A professional. The plan lasted until approximately the third joke. One of the early stories involved New York State allowing movie theaters to serve alcohol. The setup was harmless. The punchline was about my wife, Scarlett Johansson. The audience laughed. I laughed. Everything seemed normal. Then I kept reading, and suddenly the joke took a turn, a very sharp turn, straight into territory I absolutely did not want to discuss while married to Scarlett Johansson. The audience loved it. I, meanwhile, began calculating how expensive flowers would need to be. But that year wasn't memorable because of the jokes. It was memorable because of the guests. The previous year, we'd had Dr. Hattie Davis. This time, Che decided to introduce an actual practicing rabbi, a real rabbi, a genuinely kind and respected religious leader. The moment she walked out, the audience applauded warmly. I thought, great, wonderful. Surely this means we're being responsible. Surely this means we're treating serious topics with care. Then I remembered who wrote the cue cards. Che leaned toward me. Go ahead, Colin. The audience laughed immediately. He already knew, everybody knew. The rabbi probably knew. I picked up the card. The setup involved pro-Palestinian protesters walking out of a commencement speech, reasonable topic. Then came the punchline. Suddenly, I was saying things that made me want to dive underneath the desk and remain there until retirement. The audience roared. The rabbi laughed. She nearly fell out of his chair. I stared into the distance. At a certain point, self-preservation simply shuts down. You stop fighting. You become a vessel, a very frightened vessel. The night continued. A joke about Pope Francis, a joke about middle school math scores. Joke involving text messages that absolutely should never be sent to middle school students. The audience was in hysterics. Che was delighted, beginning to suspect he spent his entire year preparing specifically for this segment. Nothing else explained the level of commitment. It came a joke about ChatGPT releasing a voice assistant inspired by a character played by Scarlett Johansson. Agan, my wife, somehow she always ended up involved. I delivered the punchline. The audience screamed. She slapped the desk, and I made another mental note to buy flowers, many flowers, truckloads of flowers. the kind of flowers normally reserved for diplomatic incidents. Then things got stranger. Joke referenced the rabbi sitting beside us. Another referenced conspiracy theories. Another involved weather. The audience laughed so hard that some people were wiping tears from their eyes. It was when I finally understood the real secret of the joke swap. The audience wasn't just watching comedians tell jokes. They were watching friendship, a very dysfunctional friendship, a friendship built almost entirely on mutual sabotage, but friendship nonetheless. People could feel it. If Che genuinely wanted to hurt me, it wouldn't be funny. If I genuinely wanted revenge, it wouldn't be funny. The reason it worked was because underneath every joke was trust. A weird amount of trust, an unhealthy amount of trust. The kind of trust that says, I know you're about to throw me under a bus in front of millions of people. But I also know you'll be sitting right next to me when it happens. That's a rare thing, and audiences recognized it immediately. Of course, none of that stopped us from trying to destroy each other. In fact, it probably encouraged us. Every year we pushed further. Every year the audience expected more. And every year we somehow found new ways to make ourselves uncomfortable. Then came another holiday edition. And this one would become one of the most memorable yet. Because before the segment even began, I made a decision, a terrible decision, the kind of decision that sounds funny in a writer's room and catastrophic everywhere else. I decided that if Michael was going to make me read racist jokes, maybe I should read them in what I called a black voice. Even as I think about it now, I can hear the warning sirens. I can see the red flags. I can feel every publicist in America preparing resignation letters. Live television has a strange effect on people, especially comedians. Sometimes your brain says, don't do this. And your mouth replies, let's see where this goes. The audience laughed before I'd even finished explaining the idea. They looked confused, concerned, possibly frightened, which honestly should have been my first clue that I was making a mistake. Because if Michael Che thinks you're about to say something reckless, you've already crossed several important lines. And unfortunately, the stack of cue cards in front of me suggested things were only about to get worse, much worse. And somehow we were just getting started. By the time we reached the holiday edition of Joke Swap, I had convinced myself that I was prepared for anything. This was, of course, a lie. But it was a comforting lie, the kind you tell yourself before boarding a roller coaster or attending a family reunion where someone has recently discovered Facebook conspiracy groups. The audience was already buzzing when we sat down at the weekend update desk. They knew the routine by now. They knew that Michael Che and I were about to hand each other loaded cue cards and pretend we were doing journalism. I leaned toward the camera and said, before we do this, I know Michael is going to make me tell some racist jokes like he always does. So this time, if you don't mind, I'd like to read all the jokes in a black voice so I don't get in trouble. The audience laughed nervously. Che looked at me like a man watching his friend attempt to juggle chainsaws. I mean, Colin, I don't mind, he said. Do what you got to do, man. I don't even know what black voice is. Weird you would bring that up, I replied. With that, I picked up the first card. The joke was about Kamala Harris supporting the idea of slavery reparations. I read the setup and launched into the punchline with a level of confidence that can only be described as deeply misplaced. White people deserve our money back for all those slaves that ran away. I said. The audience erupted. Chase stared at me, stunned. I had no idea that's what you thought black voice was. At that moment, I realized I had entered a new phase of the joke swap, the phase where even Michael Che was judging me. The next joke was about a study showing that women are more likely to have an orgasm if they are in touch with their body signals. The punchline, naturally, was about the women I have sex with holding their breath until it's over. The audience laughed. Che laughed. I laughed. And then I remembered that my wife, Scarlett Johansson, was somewhere in the building. This was becoming a pattern. Every year, no matter what the topic was, people found a way to involve my marriage. It was like he had a Google alert set up for Colin Jost domestic consequences. The next card was dedicated to Scarlett herself. Y'all know Scarlett just celebrated her 40th birthday. I read, which means I'm about to get up out of there. The audience screamed. I kept reading. We just had a kid together and y'all ain't seen no pictures of him yet because he black as hell. The room exploded. I could hear people laughing so hard they were wheezing. Che was doubled over, pounding the desk. I was laughing too, partly because the joke was absurd and partly because I knew I would have to explain this to my wife later. Agon became a joke about Moana 2 setting records at the box office. The setup was innocent enough, the punchline was not. Like me and my good friend Jeffrey Epstein used to say, there's nothing like an island adventure with a teenage girl. The audience gasped, then laughed, then gasped again. I added, I'm just kidding. I would never ever sleep with a girl as dark as Moana. At this point, the audience was no longer merely laughing. We were experiencing a collective out-of-body event. Che looked at me with the expression of a proud father watching his child commit a felony, and somehow we still had one final card left. I picked it up cautiously. It was about allegations involving Jay-Z and parties hosted by Diddy. I began reading. Some people are afraid to talk about it, but not Mikey the Truth Bomb Che. Che immediately started shaking his head. No, man. No, 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 no. It continued anyway, because that is the cruel beauty of joke swap. Once you start reading, there is no turning back. Jay-Z is innocent. He wasn't even at those parties. And I know because I was. The audience lost its mind. I finished the joke with a line directed at Diddy, promising to help you off. Che buried his face in his hands. The audience was howling. And I realized something important. Uncle Che had finally created a joke so outrageous that even he wanted to stop me from reading it. That, in the world of Weekend Update, is the equivalent of winning an Olympic gold medal. When the segment ended, I leaned back in my chair, exhausted. Che looked at me and said, for real though, Costco has removed the roast beef sandwich from its menu. I knew immediately that this was not going to end well. But I ain't tripping, he read. I've been eating roast beef every night since my wife had the kid. The audience exploded. She added, no, I'm just playing, baby. You know I don't go downtown. I laughed so hard I could barely breathe. Then Che looked directly at the camera and said, geez, that's gay as hell. The audience roared. I shook my head in disbelief. And then, as if none of this had happened, Che smiled and said, I'm Michael Che. Good night. Music played, the cameras pulled back, and the audience gave us a standing ovation. As we walked off stage, I realized that Joke Swap had become more than just a comedy bit. It was a yearly ritual, public demonstration of friendship through mutual humiliation. She and I had spent years sitting behind that desk together, writing jokes about politicians, celebrities, scandals, and the endless parade of absurdity that is American life. Joke Swap was different. It wasn't polished. It wasn't carefully rehearsed. It wasn't safe. It was two friends handing each other surprises and trusting that no matter how outrageous the joke was, the other person would read it anyway. That trust is rare, especially in comedy, especially on live televisions, especially when the joke involves your wife, your career, and several international incidents. Thought back to all the moments we had shared. The white lightning joke, the dog disease condom joke, the chimpanzee culture joke, the Pope Francis joke that made me question my entire upbringing, the Rosa Parks jokes, Black Superman jokes, the Jeffrey Epstein jokes, the Beyoncé joke, the Scarlett Johansson jokes, the Rabbi Jill jokes, countless punchlines that made both of us stare into the middle distance and wonder if we should start applying for jobs at Home Depot. Each one was ridiculous. Each one was inappropriate. Each one was somehow made funnier by the fact that neither of us knew it was coming. And that was the magic of it. The audience wasn't just laughing at the jokes. They were laughing at the reactions, at the panic, at the betrayal. At the split second when one of us realized the other had once again chosen violence, they were laughing because they could see that underneath all the chaos, there was genuine affection. Michael Che and I are very different people. He is cooler than I am. He is calmer than I am. He can sit through a storm of controversy with the relaxed expression of a man waiting for his laundry to finish. I, on the other hand, react to a mildly critical tweet as if I've been summoned before Congress, but somehow we worked together for years behind that desk, telling jokes, making each other laugh, and occasionally making each other fear for our lives. When people ask me what it was like to do Joke Swap, I usually say it was terrifying, because it was. There's nothing quite like holding a cue card on live television and realizing that the next sentence could become your Wikipedia page's controversies section, but it was also exhilarating. It reminded me why I love comedy. Comedy is unpredictable. It is risky. It is collaborative. It is, at its best, a shared experience between performers and audience. And Joke Swap captured that better than almost anything else we ever did. By the end of the night, after the applause had faded and the crew had started packing up the set, Che and I stood backstage together. We were both exhausted. We were both laughing. And we were both already thinking about next year. Che looked at me and said, "You know I'm going to get you worse next time, right?" I nodded. "Yeah," I said. "I know." He smiled, I smiled back, and in that moment, I understood the true meaning of our end-of-season gift exchange. It wasn't about the jokes. It wasn't about the shock value. It wasn't even about making the audience laugh, although that was certainly part of it. It was about friendship. A very strange, very public, very reckless friendship. The kind of friendship where one person writes a joke that could ruin your week, hands it to you with a grin, and trusts that you'll read it anyway. The kind of friendship where you do the same thing right back. And honestly, after all those years behind the Weekend update desk, I couldn't imagine a better gift than that, even if I did have to buy a lot of flowers afterward.